There's an opportunity to understand the natural history of a disease, what the complications, but it also gives us a lot of opportunity to improve clinical studies and get more accurate data about how a drug impacts a disease course and what the potential safety issues are. And we can also use it to improve care because we can do a lot more monitoring in the real world setting, in somebody's home, and really see, for example, how a drug is impacting the health of that individual. So the FDA is very interested in real-world data, for many reasons, but it does really offer the opportunity to better understand the natural history of a disease, and the FDA really looks to understand what the disease would be, what would be going on with the disease in its natural setting without a medicine. So it can measure the impact of that medicine and use that information in determining whether a medicine has meaningful impact on the clinical course of the disease. It also has the opportunity for improved and more accurate data for measuring that impact, since it is gathering data in a sort of longer term and potentially a more quantifiable situation. And especially for rare diseases, it has the potential to reduce the burden of clinical trials. So any of us who have been in a clinical trial for PWS, it can be a challenge to transport our kids to the clinical trial site. There's not too many around the country. Sometimes you have to go through airports that have Starbucks, and I've been held up at the gate because we need to get a Starbucks before we get on the plane, and they know they've kind of got you there. So there is a burden of transporting our kids to a new place. We all know how well our kids adjust to new situations. Not. So if they can gather more data at home where it actually is meaningful, then that would be a way to reduce the burden of getting to these clinical sites. It can improve efficiency and also reduce costs, because every time we have to travel to a site, that's a cost usually for the sponsor. So not only is the FDA interested in this information, but also a lot of the pharmaceutical companies, because they're looking at it as a way to get better data, and be more efficient and cut costs in the clinical trial. And the other thing that it allows that the FDA, I think, is really thinking about is using it as a tool for post-marketing safety. So if they know a drug has a potential safety signal, they can then monitor that in the real-world setting and get more accurate data and not really wait until there's an adverse event. So there's a lot of potential from the FDA's standpoint about how these real-world data information can be applied. And I'll just mention that, so FPWR is a member of the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, which is an FDA academic pharmaceutical consortium, and one of the major focuses of, or one of the major projects of Citi right now is, mobile technologies, using them for endpoints, validating endpoints, and how they can be incorporated into the clinical trial process to improve the efficiency. But we also want to think about how real-world data can be used to improve the quality of life of individuals with PWS. As I said, to gain a better understanding of PWS, maybe to track, how much our kids exercise in a week over time. So, does the activity of a 4-year-old, how does it decline over time? I mean, it declines over time in the general population as well, but it may decline more rapidly with PWS. So maybe activity is something we want to be looking at PWS. I've already mentioned improving the quality and efficiency of clinical trials and reducing the burden of the clinical trial participation, but also understanding the efficacy and the challenges of any medication or any intervention in the natural environment. So again, if your doctor prescribes medicine, are you actually taking it? Is it actually having an effect? So we, understood that given that there are a lot of clinical trials ongoing in PWS, and given that there's a lot of opportunity with these different technologies, that it might be good to start to understand how it can be used in Prader-Willi syndrome. And we didn't want to just have Jessica and I sit down and figure out how it should be used in Prader-Willi syndrome, because the point of this kind of data is to gather information from the community about what's the best ways, what's the best uses of it, what are the opportunities, and what are the challenges specifically in PWS. And so we thought it would be great to have a workshop to address these questions. And we went for funding to PCORI, which is the Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute. And PCORI is an independent, nonprofit, non-governmental organization, and it was authorized by Congress as part of the Healthcare Act. And the goal of PCORI is to improve the quality and relevance of evidence to help patients make the healthcare decisions that are best for them. And at the core of Cori is that it's patient-centered. So they really want to understand what's best for the patient and bring that into the drug development process, and then also the how medicines are used. So they do a lot of what's called comparative effectiveness research. So, for example, which is better, aspirin or Tylenol, you know, those kinds of things on the market. What do patients like? What are the downside? And they also support workshops such as these, which are focused on engaging the patients into the process of developing new technologies or new medications. So our goals today are to educate all of you about real-world data tools, and we'll do that with a short series of talks. And then we want to educate these guys about Prader-Willi syndrome so they can start to understand the needs and challenges of the PWS community. And then those of you who are participating in the roundtable workshop will have a discussion with some discussion questions about how to use real-world data for PWS. And our ultimate goal is to develop some priorities about, developing some projects around real-world data use and disseminating that information not only into our community, but into other rare disease communities, because there's a lot of rare disease communities for which this kind of data is going to be really important. So we're really excited to have several speakers who will talk first about different kinds of technologies that are being used in clinical studies and in patient care. And the first one is Chris Jones. Chris has you'll be glad to know, he doesn't have a PhD in the sciences, so. So he has a PhD in English and communication, but he's been involved in science for a long time. So he's worked on registries and on technologies in the rare disease space. So he spent some time with Genzyme. He worked on patient registries. And more recently, he's been developing apps for different kinds of medical conditions, and most recently, an app for binge eating disorder, which obviously has some relevance to PWS. So we're happy to welcome him and learn a little bit about that.
We'll try and ease into the topic. I won't even go into how an English guy ends up in the biotech space and the rare disease space, but it's been a great experience, a wonderful experience, and it was actually a real honor to be with you all last night and to hear your stories and to be at the dinner. So I'm billed as the mobile app guy, and I'll do some talk about mobile app, but also maybe as the first up on the panel, I wanted to talk a little bit about the general topic. As Teresa said, I think the real-world evidence falls into three big buckets, or not even the real-world evidence, but evidence for rare diseases and therapies. Natural history, which Jessica covered well in the registry talk yesterday, and we'll talk a little bit about that. You have the clinical trials, and then you have patient-reported outcomes in the patient experience. So when you think about it, not only your participation in the clinical trials, but you are critical to the other two buckets that are key to looking at what happens in a disease. So to start off, I'm also tying back to Jessica's metaphor of a quilt in a registry. This is my metaphor. So you look at a disease over time, especially rare diseases, and you have one little snippet of a picture, like a sailboat. And they think, okay, we know what this picture is about. But then you get another piece of the pie or another piece of the reality of what's going on in a specific disease. And I think in many rare diseases, there's very little literature, there's very little publication, there's really understanding of the natural history. So you get another piece of the picture, and maybe another one over time, another publication, and eventually you're seeing a picture emerge that may be totally unrelated to what you thought was in the beginning. Now, I'm going to leave aside that Seurat went crazy putting all these points to make this picture. But I also intentionally left gaps. because especially in rare disease, the experience of putting together this picture can't always predict what kinds of data is going to come in, what kind of data has meaning. And maybe in one sense, my experience of coming from my background and really is a matter of digital and communications is really how I ended up at Genzyme and then working in the rare disease registries is what's the story that builds over time? And that is something that can change as the research and the data is developed. So let me just start with a Sunday morning anecdote. Coffee. I don't drink caffeinated coffee because it makes me anxious. So this is actually decaf, even though it's early in the morning, which may be totally different than what most of you in the room are doing. So you have an anecdote, right? It makes me anxious, one person. But the overall experience of coffee and caffeine gets me stimulated, wakes me up. There's probably, I don't even know how many clinical trials have been done on caffeine and coffee, but it's pretty well accepted. There's a scientific consensus what stimulants and caffeine do. But I bet you still meet people that say, I can drink it in the middle of the night and it doesn't even keep me up. So the effect on different people at different times, even though there might be published literature that says one thing, it can be experientially different for different people. And of course, personalized medicine and genetics is changing our understanding of who responds to what drugs or therapies or interventions. I like this one. Anecdotal evidence reliable? One man says yes. and it's a funny, it looks like an Onion comedy piece here. The point is, obviously, that it's extremely frustrating for individual patients or you all as family members to say, but this is happening to me, right? It's like when you take your car down to the garage and the mechanic doesn't believe you, and and you know your reality. You know it's happening to you. The question is how to get all of those experiences, or the quilt, as Jessica said, put into some kind of study or data that makes meaning. This is a picture of starlings. Actually, I lived along the South Shore of Boston for a while, and we used to see starling flocks. And they fly, I don't know if you've ever seen them, they fly like schools of fish in the sky. They have, I don't even know if they know where they're going, but they move in unison, and they're extremely coordinated. And they're in total agreement about which direction they're going to cut, left or right. But does that tell us, do they know where they're going? Is there a certain direction? So obviously that's a difficult scenario to say, well, yeah, we know what's going to happen as a group, right? We know what's going to happen for individuals within the group. In medicine, to maybe bring this a little closer to home, a physician can see one patient and write a case study. And I don't know if you've ever read or looked up case studies that physicians write. They read like little stories, right? Like I might come into the office and say, this caffeine is really making me anxious. And he'll write like, there's a guy who came in my office, he's a real stressed out consultant, and he needs a haircut, and he's probably stressed out by his own life, not by the coffee. But they observe one person, right? And if they do that enough, they're going to say, hey, we've seen enough observations of people being stressed out by some intervention, and then they want to test one specific variable to identify, well, is that what's happening? And if we can repeat those results, right, this is just basic science, right, we're kind of warming up here today. And eventually you can come to some kind of treatment guidelines, right? If all the physicians treat and talk to each other and say, hey, if we do X, Y, Z with certain patients, we see a response, maybe we should all get together in our association meetings and come up with some guidelines about how to, treat ADHD isn't a famous example for, where they've come up with a whole protocol of how it should be identified, what interventions you should take, and so forth. So different types of evidence. Let me just show this picture. I got into the eating disorder app partly because of my daughter who has an eating disorder and is recovering very well, but was extremely stressful. And to understand why and when events happened or why certain responses come out at different times. It's a very complicated, situation, as you guys all live, I'm sure. But to put a structure around it, why do they refer to it as real world, right? Because a clinical trial is a structured, controlled thing, right? It's a construct. And let's take the hoop house with growing lettuce, right? We have a controlled environment. We want to reduce as many variables as possible because maybe we want to test an organic compound on the rows on the right and leave the ones untouched on the left. And we want to see if the organic addition we do to the rows on the right are going to produce more lettuce. You get the idea. And we're trying to take as many variables out of the picture. So let's go back to this picture for a minute. Imagine these are the clinical trials in PWS, for example. And everything else in the picture is somehow what's happening, quote, out there, outside the trials. Let's say we were testing the organic compound in this environment. It's totally uncontrolled. There's no construct. It's just simply a mess of reality. There's no specific protocol we're testing. It's unpredictable, right? Do we know what's going to cause response? And it's also dynamic and changing all the time. So these are the challenges, and I'm sure some of the other speakers are going to talk about, how do you create some knowledge out of that picture? In the mobile app space, right, this is one way of, obviously key point of getting data is, going out, observing, collecting data from the field, right? And we all know, like, these things in our pockets are passively collecting and contributing data on us. Here's the trend that Google says the Providence Mall right across the street on a Saturday afternoon on an hourly basis. So if you go in the morning, you're going to have more room in the mall to shop. Intuitively, something you might know, but you've seen these little trend lines that Google builds out of passive data. Where are they getting the data uploaded from our phones, and why is Verizon sharing it with Google? I don't even. It gets me too upset. But anyway, we do, at least we get something out of it, right? And obviously, we all know our traffic apps, right, which are passively reporting data. And then on the right, I just picked a screenshot from Lose It. Maybe you have used that personally. Here the add food, add exercise. I have to prospectively put data in, and I have to keep track of something. And the idea, obviously, is that if I put something in, it's going to show me over time what kind of trend lines or behavior I have, and that I'm going to monitor myself and see if I can change my own behavior, which is an interesting little psychological conflict, that you put your phone in the middle between you and yourself. So this is my own sort of simple definition, real-world health research. There's probably 100 different ways to define it. Researching change over time in actual real-world settings, such as a patient or observer's homes, physician practices, other field settings. These are some examples. Observational studies. Observational studies deliberately do not have any intervention, right? So a typical clinical trial with a drug, you intervene in a certain visit schedule, certain requirements, thus the requirements that Teresa mentioned, you have to go in at a certain time, right, in order to obviously minimize the variable of time, right? So they construct a visit schedule. Observational studies are more passive, right? They're going to observe what happens between you and your physician or you and your family in a, quote, natural course, right? In whatever behavior or whatever timelines that you and the physician decide. Longitudinal studies are a little bit different than just observational studies, but they're constructed over a long period of time to see the change. Registries can fall into this camp. I've worked in registries like Gaucher disease that are over 25 years old now, started with Excel spreadsheets, and obviously now moved into all the other tools that can be used to get data. So Registries are a whole subject in itself. There's many types of registries, and they get constructed differently. But they're extremely important tools, as Jessica was saying, for understanding the difference between all of your kids, for example, the differences across subpopulations or the subcohorts, if you will, age-related questions, or even just understanding, that natural history of a disease. And then registries also get used by the FDA to say, you're also going to follow all the patients after your clinical trials are done. You're going to follow all of them for 15 years, for example. So it becomes a treatment outcome and a post-approval requirement in many cases as well. So starting the registries the way that you all have is a great thing, because it can evolve over time and contribute to multiple stakeholders to try and minimize the fact that in a rare disease, you want to avoid cutting up all the data into smaller slices than you already have. Fred was talking about Rhythm's study, for example, proposing maybe 100 patients based on the Zafgen trial. That's a lot of patients for a rare disease trial. So you guys are in some ways have an advantage going there, because you have some more numbers to gather, I think, into your trials. I pulled out one example of the longitudinal space. I worked in Pompe disease at Genzyme for a while, helped start the registry with the team there. The pivotal trial was 18 patients, infants. The endpoint was survival. The question was, what's the clinical benefit for older patients, milder patients, patients with different phenotypes or genotype where maybe they would have a slower progression of the disease? All of that was unknown after the drug was approved. The registry was part of showing clinical benefit in that case. And the company was able to avoid a clinical trial. The patients were able to avoid a clinical trial. So that was the registry side. In addition, Erasmus Medical Center in Amsterdam had started a patient-reported survey and a questionnaire. And over time, they went from early publications on the clinical manifestations, and then eventually came a publication with 261 patients showing survival in adult patients with Pompe disease on drug. So all of that coming out of a patient-reported questionnaire. Jessica, how am I doing on time? Check. Good? Let me show you a quick example. This is probably a little bit more of some of the other talks. This was an opt-in program in Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, and they put sensors around the home. So it wasn't necessarily mobile apps, but it was sensors looking at movements between rooms and also other activities like logging into a computer, typing in your password, time out of home. How many times did you go out your front door, all looking at online video, as well as a survey. Now that was an opt-in situation. Obviously that's fairly aggressive in terms of giving up some privacy, but these patients wanted to do this. This is the data that came from that sensing. So what you're looking at here, and this is courtesy of Oregon Health Sciences, is all the movements between the rooms during the day in different colors. You see the other rooms in the house by color. And this is nighttime where movement is down. So you have healthy on the left. And then movement between the rooms during the day went down, and movement at night went up. And diagnosis with Parkinson's was right around the same time. And then looking at on a particular treatment, and the pattern going back to a little bit more natural movement between the rooms and less movement at night. In other words, they're sleeping better. So all of that is not clinical trial data. That's observational real-world data coming out of the home. Looking at a little bit of the instruments that we can use, the very traditional instruments that you probably all know, SF-36, classic quality of life instrument. There are many disease-specific instruments that have been developed. The term that is often used, and you may have heard of it, is it validated, right? And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. In other words, does the tool measure what it's supposed to measure? And the analogy I was thinking about to maybe have this just click for us all, when you use a piece of material in a spaceship, let's say, you got to test the material before you test the spaceship, right? You got to test the engineering of the material before you use it in an actual practice. Surveys and real-world data are the same thing. In order for the FDA to accept patient-reported outcome, submitting data with therapy for review, it needs to know that you tested the instrument so that the data is reliable. So that's what validated surveys are. Obviously, in the new world, we're looking at, and I took a screenshot of the app that just went live recently in Binge. Real-world data is not necessarily coming from validated tools. It's coming from our phones. It's coming from our apps. It's coming from Fitbit. So you end up getting a whole pool of data that might not necessarily sit under a protocol or use a validated instrument, but is extremely valuable, right? Because you start to see what's happening with different patients, different families, different episodes. So some of the differences between the classic surveys and maybe mobile apps, it's more real time. If an event happens, you know the circumstances around it. As opposed to, let's say, filling out a survey once every 6 months. I worked on a registry that's doing a patient-reported survey a couple years back in FOP disease, another rare disease, and patients fill out a survey every 6 months, which is fine, but you're going every 6 months and then asking questions on memory, versus a mobile app. You can immediately report it. You can do it today, tomorrow, whenever it's convenient. During this talk, if you're bored, you just boom, 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 you enter your breakfast or whatever you're trying to do, and it captures the more immediate. And of course, when you enter it, it can also go along with the passive data, right? It might know, for example, in binge eating, were you out at a restaurant, right? It might know where your geolocation. It might know the time you entered a particular data a point versus your behavior around your exercise, let's say. So you're able to kind of look at other variables more holistically, I guess is the way to say it. Now there's trade-offs with that, right? There's no necessarily right or wrong data, it's different quality data used for different purposes, if that makes sense. So to build on Teresa's point, this is a quote from actually a colleague of mine from Genzyme, and she was at a meeting with the FDA on development of pediatrics. And start with qualitative research. The patients and families themselves will tell you what the right constructs are. She's talking about developing endpoints, right? She's talking about what do you all see in your kids? What are the parameters that would really be meaningful to study? If you were here yesterday and you heard, let's say, Fred's talk from Rhythm, and a hunger score, 1 to 10. Simple, easy, straightforward, very good measure for a clinical trial. How much does that leave out of your experience with your kids, right? So that's where the exploration of other tools and other reports, and some of that data may end up becoming important with payers, which I'll come back to in a second. So in developing apps, anything digital, web-based, right? Ethnographic research, that is looking at what's happening in somebody's reality from their perspective. Came out of cultural and anthropology studies. This boy really trying to understand how pigeons behave. Getting down in the dirt. That's one way for us to develop apps that are meaningful for users, right? So you want to be able to understand, how do they think? What do their worlds look like? I mean, you guys obviously have very, adapted environments for your kids with the locked cabinets and so forth. So, what are the issues that come up? What are common among different patients and what are different? I'm working on a project right now, for example, where they want to do videos of their boys in Duchenne and disease, but they want the mothers to pick an assessment themselves, which is really interesting, right? Think about that. You're basically picking your own endpoint. So maybe 3 of the videos would be walking up steps, and everybody does walking up steps, but somebody else does getting in and out of a car or so forth. So interesting to think about those types of things. Maybe that'll get your thinking about the roundtable discussions coming up. And maybe just to wrap up, a couple comments on the FDA side of this. Going back to our frustration of why isn't it faster, right? It's a trade-off, right? Real-world data is typically faster because we don't have to do all the requirements that the FDA needs to see from a regulated trial. And that's a tug and pull, right? I mean, if you followed the Sarepta decision or looked at anything there, or look it up if you haven't yet, a very interesting, debate between the science and the patient-reported community. The patients knew a lot faster what was happening with their boys, but the FDA doesn't know if it's reliable. It's anecdotal, what happened to you. So the work is to move beyond anecdotal into the trend and the data that will help you when you get down to filing. And then also thinking about what would help you in your daily life, right? Some apps have nothing to do with regulatory filings. They just have to do with helping the community and understanding what's going on. A couple of quick snapshots from the app that I was developing over the last year, trying to put together a more holistic approach to binge eating, for example, not related to filing a regulatory submission or anything, but looking at cognitive therapy. So there's learning modules and coping modules in here that you go through in stages, more like you would with a clinician or a therapist for binge eating. I was thinking about maybe some of the analogies, talking with some of you last night. As I understand it, right, there can be behavioral episodes with your kids, and when and where they happen. Similar kind of thing happened with binge as an event, right? A lot of the patients are coming out of a trauma of some kind, and binge is related, very intertwined with the trauma in their lives. Understanding when, where, and why they're binging, getting some self-monitoring, keeping a journal. All these things are used in a therapist and patient in mental health processes and cognitive therapy. And so the app is really trying to help look at walking through some of the learning, like self-monitoring, or looking at videos from some of the faculty for patients that don't go in and see a clinician, right? So mobile fits very well with patients that are far away from therapy, don't have access to experts, don't want to go in and see an expert or a physician, so there's a lot of underserved people who are dealing with binge or other eating disorders that don't go see a therapist. Some have estimated almost 80% of patients don't go see a therapist. So mobile has a role to play there. And I think I'm probably getting close to time here, so I'll just maybe stop there. Maybe reference for your own Google research. You can look up the FDA roadmaps on developing endpoints with patient-reported involvement. There are specific endpoints on developing patient-reported outcomes. Not endpoints, I shouldn't say that. Specific principles. Is it reliable? Content validity. All the testing of the data that you are collecting. There are guidances on all of that. And again, deciding on what real-world tool that you're using. It could be just getting data in order to develop some kind of insight on issues, to develop endpoints in a study versus developing a tool that you're going to use within a study. So I think maybe I'll stop there.
Glenn Irvin, who unfortunately don't have a full bio on because you're filling in for your colleague Luciano, but their company MedV is working on devices and specifically is working on developing a device in Prader-Willi syndrome.
Thanks, Jessica. Good morning, everybody. I'm Glenn. And if you looked in the conference proceedings, you'll realize that I'm actually not Luciano Castillo. It's my colleague, and he's not here today, but I am. So what I'd like to talk about today is, and if you looked at the abstract, our approach of creating lots of data, but specifically health data. And this would be, as Chris was talking about, real world, real time, essentially continuous. And I think everybody understands over the last 10 years, especially 15, with the increase in electronic capability, with the infrastructure, with the clouds, the networks worldwide, you now have a lot of access to information about everything. And the miniaturization of devices now allows us to create devices that can be put on your body in different ways. It could be textiles, it could be a wearable on the arm, on the leg. And our take on this is a wearable device, but we're also looking at it from an ecosystem perspective. And I want to give some highlights today about what we're doing, why we think it's important, and then specifically for the Prader-Willi community, opportunities that we think are joint. So you think about it, every day there's tons of data. You know, my daughter has who knows how many apps on her device, and she's got pictures and videos and Musical.lys. You know, it's probably 10 to 50 megabytes a day. And then when you think about this across a few 100 million kids, there's a lot of information that's going into some archives somewhere. You think about manufacturing, food manufacturing, electronic device manufacturing, car manufacturing, tons and tons and tons of data. Then when you get to the healthcare industry, there's a disconnect. You don't have the same type of information that's being built in. It's not in a structured and an ordered way. There was no bio on me. I'm a PhD chemical engineer by training for many years now. And, you know, I think back specifically to products I worked on. I used to work with Eastman Kodak Company in Rochester, New York, and we, for folks in here that can remember print film, we used to make print film that would go out to movie houses around the world. And a specific product I was working on, we would make about 2 billion square feet of this product every year. That's a lot of material. And when we would look into our ERP systems, we know where all of the material came from, all of the incoming testing. As we're manufacturing it, we've got sensors all over the place as it moves through different steps of the process. Now think about yourself. You know, you go maybe once a year. Chris was mentioning that there's some reticent folks out there that may not go at all, or they may go every few years. You'll get some information, and then that information drops into some place. Now, if you're a really mobile person like myself, I've been all over the country, I've lived in different countries, and you stop at a clinic, you do whatever it may be, and you know, I've got information that's all over the place, and I don't have access to it. So when you think about solving problems and trying to create models to understand different situations, different conditions, that's not a good method. And thankfully, though, because of everything that's happened with the advent of apps, the advent of power in your hand with the devices, and the change in the mindset, there's an industry cycle going on in healthcare. I think a lot of people here are part of that. If you got passion about yourself and your loved ones, you're pushing for that change. And especially for something when it's connotated as rare, that usually means there's no big companies usually putting a lot of attention into it, a lot of money that goes into it, and that's very difficult to reach new solutions. So, you know, a key point that I want to talk about is we're moving from reactive to predictive and from patient to empowered. And I'll go into some points about this. And specifically, as we start creating all of this data, we need to have effective ways to manage it, to be able to create new information and new ideas, and also have it so that other people can look at it. You know, I mentioned briefly about, unfortunately, this is a little cut off, but it says the physical health, and it's, you know, visit doctor once a year, visit dentist twice a year. That's kind of the mantra that's out there. A lot of people don't do that, but you know, that's the standard process. Unfortunately, you're not getting a lot of data. This could be a good bet for a number of people, especially when you're young, but you know, why take a bet when the technology is there in order to create information about yourself, about your health status, your health profile? You know, here's a company called Dexcom. I don't know if you guys are familiar with them. They're on the market for about the last 5 or 7 years. They got a continuous glucose monitor. And this is one that's basically, it's implanted on the body. They got a small lancet that's taken the sample, and you know, they're continuously monitoring the information. So as you think about this, instead of using a single point tester and you test it 2 or 3 times a day, which is kind of the standard process, you don't know when you test where you're going to be at or 2 or 3 hours later. And you know, they've published some data, and this is out of one of their investor reports, and it's looking at your blood glucose as a function of time across a day. And you can see that, here's a point that's measured with this device, here's a point measured with this device. But when you look at the continuous profile, things are really changing. And that gives you an idea about the power of continuous data. For the solutions we're creating, which you can't see up here, a wearable device called DigiNurse, and it's specifically focused on the health status. And I'll talk about how this is done in a moment. An app to centralize all of this information, both on the device but in a cloud framework, so that we can use that information to apply machine learning algorithms. And everybody here is familiar with machine learning, even if you're not familiar with the word. If you think about things such as Siri, Amazon's Echo, they're using this technology that is essentially kind of thinking for itself, or it's learning as it goes. And it's all just algorithms, and it's mostly human beings that are giving it the framework, but this is becoming a much more powerful technology. And then, as I mentioned, remote diagnostics. So I'll talk a little bit about each one of these. Specifically for the DigiNurse, the devices that we're integrating into this handheld, which we think would be useful for the community here. At the top, you can't see it, but there's heart rate, skin temperature, obviously your SpO2, your saturation percentage of oxygen, the calories used or burned throughout the day, and then weight, BMI, first generation control and alerts, a graphical visual interface so that you can look at this information and see it in a meaningful, pertinent way. And it's configurable so that you can change it. If you want to look at a graph over time, if you want to look at a graph, specific points, you want to look at different points in your life, you can do all of this. And manual data entry. Not all of the data you're going to get is going to be on this device. It's not a magic device, but it can do quite a bit, and including take in different information that you can then use to create models, which deep learning is the same thing as machine learning, and we allow this data analysis to go to create models, whether it's in a clinical setting, whether it's group setting, whether it's somebody doing a meta-analysis, and also for accuracy improvement of the devices. And I'll talk about that because accuracy is really critical when you have a device such as this. And then activity and steps, and then arterial blood temperature. And that's actually different than skin temperature. It's talking about the temperature that's inside you just a little bit. And that's really important. There's no easy way to measure that today that's not invasive. And we're looking at a non-invasive way to do this. If you're familiar with Penn's bioheat equation, that equation basically gives some details, some parameters that you can look at, and then get an estimate of what is the blood temperature. And this also gives you some idea about the metabolic rate. And understanding your metabolic rate is useful for a number of things. Things that we have in development are skin blood perfusion, a Gen 1 urinary analysis, not with this one, and then behavioral tracking. And I think, again, this community has some interest in behavioral tracking as well. And what it doesn't say up top is we're building an ecosystem with real-time diagnostics and alerting. So we think this is exciting. So now you go from that framework where once a year you get some information and now it's somewhere you can't access it, and then if they give it to you, it's on a small drive, and then what do you do with it? To, okay, we've got information that's now inside of a server, an archive somewhere. You've got a web interface or a portal, an app so that you can integrate new information, you can take information out, you can learn about what's going on. And then you can also take EMR or electronic health records, electronic medical records information, integrate it into your system or your profile, offline and self-testing, essentially remote diagnostics. There's a lot of that. Blood glucose is one of the common ones. And the fitness trackers, which are pretty popular right now, except for the last quarter, they dropped quite a bit in unit sales. The idea there is that you're gathering information, there's early adopters, and you can also integrate that information into the system. Now, the goals here is really to simplify the process of monitoring health status. We think there's a lot of value just in simplifying it there, and I've got a value stream map to really explicate that point in a second. capture and archive clinical quality data with easy-to-use and informative interfaces. Then you've got a software, or essentially a hub, that you can take this information, and now you can share it with important people in your life, the decision makers. Everybody can look at it in a much more quick and reliable way. For the PWS community in particular, we feel, and we're really targeting the wearable for simplification of daily and weekly health care process flow. And you may be wondering, why is our company looking at PWS when it's considered a rare condition? One of our team members has a child that has the condition, and that's a champion. So when you look at this, there's a lot of value here, and then as an engineer and scientist, there's commonalities across other things that people can use. So we can develop this tool, and with minor modifications, we can really focus on this community, but also it becomes relevant to the wider population in general. Now, the other thing that we want to do is data model development, so you can understand what are the triggers for these behavioral events. I think everybody here has had behavioral events personally. I know I've got pissed off before, right? And when that happens, it's usually a buildup. And what you don't know is your body has responses to that process. And then when you kind of snap, there's things that can be tracked. We don't do that today, but we know with our devices that we can track a number of things. And then now you think about this, okay, you track the first event, 50 events later, now you've got this profile. And you've got all of this other data, and think about it in terms of a data matrix. Now you can go in and start trying to create correlations as to why did that happen? What set that off? What was the trigger? And as Chris mentioned with his really great analogy of the quilt, it's little pieces that you start stringing together. But the first thing you need is the data. So that's, the key goal for us is to create the data and make it available so that you can look at model development. And I'll talk in a minute about machine learning and how machines, we can effectively set them loose to go in and look at these really complex sets of data. Because, our goal, there was a mention of looking at 100 or maybe 200 or 50 patients in a study, but we want to do millions at a time. So when you have millions in the database, you need an effective way, as I mentioned earlier, to look at that data. The data needs to be structured in a way that you can utilize it for this type of processing. For instance, we were working with the ARC Center in Pensacola, Florida, earlier this year, and one of the challenges, we were receiving data from them, and it's tremendous the amount of data they actually are capturing in a handheld way. But the data, when you have gaps, it becomes more difficult to model that with a higher degree of confidence. So, we're looking at ways how we can simplify it, and we think this solution is one that will really help. But that model, having the data in a good way, is really key. And I think there's a talk later that's going to go into sleep disorders. And again, these are things that are difficult to uncover what's the underlying issue. Okay, let's attack it in a specific way. I'm not going to go into this in detail because it wasn't meant to be an eye chart today, but it's a little tough. In lean manufacturing, lean engineering, we do a thing called value stream mapping. And when you do the value stream map, we typically look at a current state, and you look at what the process is. And the member of our team, she gave us what it is in a week for the care of her child. And this will probably resonate with a number of folks here. She's got, you got to do the weight, you do it at home, you do it with the physician, you got the pulse ox, pedometer, blood pressure, temperatures. And what we do is we go through and we make an assessment of what's the total time and also cost that's involved in doing that. And from an engineering perspective, you want to think about that and say, okay, here's one. And when you look at it, it's almost 2 full weeks out of a 52-week year that she spends specifically taking this information. It's 2 weeks out of 52 weeks. That's a tremendous amount of time. Look at your community across tens of thousands now. So when you look at the people commitment, it's very, very, very huge. And that's just on the data taking. Then when you look at the medical care team, which is extensive, and if you look at an event, in this particular case, if she's got an unacceptable increase in weight, you've got to go through this protocol of, okay, check with the primary care, then check with endocrinologists, and then they talk with the nutritionist. So you do this, and it kind of goes in a sequential way, where if you now take a look at utilizing a device here, we can not take all of the time out, but we can take quite a bit of the time out by automating a number of these processes. So I mentioned it was 2 weeks. Now in the future state, it would be about 2 days out of the year. Again, multiplied across tens of thousands of people, there's a lot of savings just on time alone, on cost. But the other one is the psychological tax. Nobody really talks about that. It's an intangible. It's a strain and a stress to always be doing that. I mean, you want to make sure it's good. It's critical to have the data correct. Really key. Now, the other things that you get in Advantage, you can get sleep quality measurements, BMI, arterial blood temp, and the data is continuous. So machine learning. Okay. This is important. I'm not going to dig into all of the equations here, but this is basically like your mind. I mean, you've got an incredible machine that's working, and a lot of it is subconscious, and it's doing these kind of calculations all of the time. What we're trying to do, and what many people do with this is, for instance, we want to take all of these biometric values that we're now measuring, you parameterize these, and you create different models, different algorithms that can go in and create these models. Now, for instance, here we're using neural networks. It might be support vector regression. There's a lot of different names, a lot of different things you can do. But the idea is you want to have a lot of good information that comes in, and the idea here is to improve the specific type of biometric data. One thing, if you've used a Fitbit, if you've used a Garmin device, any of these, that data is not very reliable. And there's a lot of reasons why. It can be the specific design. It could be the semiconductor chipset. It could be it's just not on tight enough that day and you'll get erroneous data. So that's really critical to think about. And using this technology, we can improve specifically the data. Now here's some real data. It's heart rate. It's when we test against our system, we use other controls, so to speak. And you look at this particular one, samples across time for the heart rate. The heart rate jumps, significantly, over 100 beats per minute. And either this person was having some really strenuous situation going on, or the data's not correct. And we knew that the data's not correct. The problem here is, if this is the device that you're relying on and this goes into a database, then that data is really no good. You're not going to be able to utilize it. Now, we applied a neural network in order to go in and allow it to determine which data is good and which is not. Again, here's the bad data. And now that bad data with the neural network, you see this small red line. I think these slides are going to be available later for you to take a look at. But this red line is now the data that's been processed. So now we've been able to improve this data, and we've done this across a number of different tests. I mentioned very briefly, and I've only got a couple minutes, but Suter Sensors, there's a MIMIC database out there. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the MIMIC, but there's a lot of information. PPG, arterial blood pressure, EKG. So what we're doing right now is we've extracted a lot of data out of this. It's anonymized, so we don't know whose data it is. And we're letting the machine learn in order to estimate what would be a person's blood pressure, because having a blood pressure all the time is not an easy thing to do. Typically, you go in and you got a spigometer, you got a cuff on, and that's, again, 1 point, versus you've got that blood pressure all day long. When you sleep, you got a sleep disorder, you may see different things, and you can, again, start creating the correlations. If you look at a PPG Spectra, there's a lot of information. We typically process this through a small filter, and you'll get the heart rate out. But, as an engineer and scientist, when I look at this, there's a lot of information here. Look, you've got peaks, you've got changes in between the peaks, the shape of this curve, as your age, as your arteries change, all of that really matters. And it's happening all the time, and we don't know it because we're not measuring it. But the technology is there to measure. Behavior predicting, again, we would use the same type of technology. And this is actually an exciting one because we've got some things that I'm not going to talk about today that are in process. Of course, with the machine learning, but also from a device perspective. And that's where we think it's really intriguing to be able to start measuring when these events are happening. And remember earlier I kind of foreshadowed that you can measure what's happening to the body actually pretty accurately. One last one, I think I just got a couple slides and I'm on the 20-minute edge here. I'm on the precipice, but I want to get these out. Urinalysis. Who here has done this cup and you've got to go and then you got to take it back and then they tell you, don't make it dirty, clean it, bring it back as quickly as possible, all these kind of things. The reason is there's a lot of information that we void out of our body. When you urinate, there's quite a bit of information that's captured there. And I've got some of the things that you would typically look at in a standard test panel. One of the things through other technologies that we worked on, we're bringing it to this space, we can utilize Raman Spectroscopy in order to capture real-time data in the stream, which basically means when you're going to the bathroom, you can urinate into this probe and we capture the data real time. We don't get every single thing yet because you got to develop each one specifically. You got to use lasers with different wavelengths, et cetera, but that can come with time. But early on, we're looking at things like creatinine, albumin, beta-hydroxybutyrate, acetoacetic acid. Okay, what do those mean? They basically can give you an idea about your kidney function, hypertension, diabetes 2, ketone diets. So these things are important, this community to a lot of people in general. And we can do that real time. And the specific thing that I didn't mention is this data then is also captured into the cloud. So now you can move this off to your physician. You don't have to make all the decisions. You send that off, they take a look at it. And from a money perspective, you can remove a lot of these out of the supply chain. You don't have to make them. You don't have to dispose them. They don't have to go into the landfill. There's a lot of value. You don't need the person to test it. It's all done fairly automated. And here's data that shows when you just look at the stream spectra, it's pretty close. And it's close enough that you can get information and extract valuable info from a calibrated curve on that. We're working now to improve the resolution, the signal-to-noise ratio, and also the industrial design, because you got to think, there's a lot of different people and people urinate in different ways, so you got to try to standardize that process so that you get good information. That's really critical when you think about building new systems. I won't talk about the ketone diet, but from a future state, again, this is really what we're pushing and what we're going after. So when you start thinking about real-world data, most of these sensors are here. They're available today. We're integrating them. And not just us, there's other people out there. So that's why I said there's a cycle change that's going on. I think it's really exciting for the industry, but also for human beings in particular, because now we'll start knowing about ourselves more. It's a shame. I've got a car and I know more about when it's been serviced and record and when they turn the tires and change the oil. I can't pull up my own records, and it's not for lack of trying. It's just not the infrastructure that's out there. Now, in summary, our goal is really to make this large data available, but also process it in a meaningful way. And we'll utilize all the machine power, the computing systems out there, and then just rational thought on how to do this. And we're not trying to do it alone. We're going to partner with people, and we already have some partnerships specifically for certain types of app development. We don't want to recreate everything. That's one of the great things is, we want to put the pieces together. That's why I call it an ecosystem. So thanks a lot. I apologize for running a little fast through it, but we can chit-chat later.
Our next speaker is Pam Gavin from NORD. For those of you that don't know, NORD is the National Organization of Rare Disorders. So as parents and families, you come to FPWR. FPWR is a member of a larger professional organization that represents hundreds of other foundations just like ours. So we're thrilled to have Pam here. NORD has been a phenomenal partner and supporter of FPWR, helping us with communications with FDA. They are the host platform for the Global PWS Registry, and so we're thrilled to have Pam here. She's going to speak with us about a collaboration that NORD has going on with Trio Health.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here, and it's great to have a meeting within driving distance of where I live, so that's a special treat. So I feel like you're coming to my backyard, so it's fantastic. So thank you again for the Foundation for Prader-Willi Research for allowing us to be part of your discussions today. As Jessica said, my name is Pam Gavin, and I'm working with the National Organization for Rare Disorders. I've been with the organization for about 6 years. I've been in the rare disease community for probably about 20, and I'm happy to be here today. As Jessica mentioned, NORD's gotten involved in the support and the development of tools for our patient organization members who are interested in studying the natural history of disease, the progression of disease. So we decided to pool our resources together, develop a platform to make it cost-effective and easy for our member organizations who are interested in conducting these kinds of studies and establishing these kinds of registries to do so in a cost-effective manner. In the process, we're always looking at what's going on in the community and ways to bring value to our members, because that's a huge part, a cornerstone of NORD's mission and purpose. And we came across an organization called Trio Health. Trio Health, and I'm speaking on behalf of them, so I'm not going to do as good a job as Brent Clough from the CEO of Trio Health, but I'm going to do my best. Trio Health is a healthcare technology company, and they're located predominantly on the West Coast. They have a small office in the Boston area, but they're focused on disease management, and in particular, trying to understand real-world data, using real-world data to understand the patient's experience and ways in which the stakeholders in the healthcare community impact patient outcomes. They've spent most of their initial years working in cancer and then in the more common diseases, but we have established a partnership with them to pursue for our member organizations in the rare disease community the access to their expertise for rare disease-specific programs. So I apologize, I'm kind of in between glasses and not wearing glasses, so I'm going to hesitate back and forth here a little bit. There are lots of questions that their platform set out to understand better and accomplish. Why aren't we making decisions? Well, so first of all, we know in clinical trials the environment is very well-defined and managed, and it needs to be because it's a regulatory process that's underway. But when you get into the real world, what are the impacts to patients' outcomes and experiences that may or may not mimic what's happening in a clinical phase 3 clinical trial, or even some phase 4 trials? Why aren't we making decisions that benefit access to that information so we can leverage the opportunities, especially in the rare disease space where those opportunities may be few and far between to get those treatments, whether it be symptomatic or not, in the hands of the patients and families that need them. So NORD established a partnership with them for a variety of reasons, as I mentioned a moment ago. One, so that the resources and tools that they have developed can be made available to our members in the rare disease community. And then the other is so that we could look at data in aggregate collectively with our members and advocates that are advocating at the state and federal level for issues and challenges and roadblocks that we see, that through the data that we can advocate for change, whether it be policy change, regulatory change, whatever that the data may represent. A key aspect of what the platform is built upon is being able to measure the performance of every stakeholder, whether that be a clinician who's providing medical care to a patient, whether it be the patient's experience themselves or their actions, whether it be a specialty pharmacy, an insurer, how do their policies, how do the plans impact, how do the costs impact, whether it be a PBM. It's a very complex system, and this is an opportunity to lay on top of it a microscope so you can understand how that may impact the outcome to the patient. Another key aspect of what the the TRIO program is all about, which is also very relevant to what you're discussing over the 2 days here, is it's not TRIO Health that is advocating on behalf of one change or another, or one positive story to another. That's reflective in the real world data that they analyze, but it's really the medical experts. So the very important part of what they do is scientific publications through the development of scientific steering committees that are independent and unbiased. And so you can see in the right-hand corner, and I have some examples that Brent shared with me to make available to all of you, that their goal is to be independent and have the voice of those medical experts and bring light to what the data shows. So the platform is web-based. The technical part of the TRIO program is web-based and it's patient-centric. It's also disease-centric. So each time it gets implemented, it's implemented from the ground up for every disease. It's customizable, it's configurable, and that's all important. That's all very important because the metrics and the aspects of the disease have to be reflected in the platform and have to be a part of what the different stakeholders see and do. So many of these points get articulated in some of the slides that Brent gave me, so I'm going to pass them up for some of the more graphical representations. It's really important that the platform supports capturing information and providing tools to these stakeholders who use the platform throughout what's often called the patient journey. So that means before therapy, during therapy, potentially out of therapy. Again, that trajectory really depends on the disease state, but also the patient's experience and the therapies and how they get brought into the patient's medical regimen. The same with the data. There are core data aspects that we would expect to see throughout that continuum, but there's also the ability to customize it and make it really unique so that you're looking at what's important to Prader-Willi, which is something we're going to be talking about in the roundtable discussions. So you can see prior to therapy, there's data categories and data elements, examples. The drug regimen, for example, insurance information is more standardized across the board, but labs may or may not be applicable. And during therapy, the different data sets, and out of therapy, outcomes, discontinuation of use, for what reason, et cetera. So I like the previous speaker gave some real good life examples of how real-world data, we use real-world data to understand aspects of our lives, whether it's how well your car has been serviced. When I look at this slide, I think of FedEx. I can buy something on Amazon, and if I'm a Prime member, in 2 days, get access to that product potentially, and it could be across the country from me. I can also take that FedEx tracking number and see where my package is at any point in time. Well, the same similar concept, not the same, similar concept is applicable on the TRIO platform. The idea is to understand once a prescription has been written, where is it in the labyrinth of the medical care service paradigm that we live in, and what can each of the stakeholders that contribute positively or negatively to that process, what do they need to know, and what can they do to help expedite, not only make the process more efficient, but also more effective to hopefully leverage better outcomes for the patient. So everything is time-stamped and tracked. Every phase is tracked, and when you think about being able to have this information captured as a byproduct of what the users are doing on the platform, they don't have to consciously enter any of this data. It gets entered as a byproduct of their performing functions, and you lay on top of this pretty fancy or pretty powerful, I should say, analytical tools. There's a lot that you can do right out of the gate with this information. So when the program gets implemented, as I mentioned earlier, different stakeholders have access to different portals to be able to use to manage. So for example, physicians can use it to manage the health care of their patients. They often can see and get more information about how well a patient's been on therapy before the patient comes in for their next visit, and not have to rely on anecdotal information as an example. They can see which pharmacies are performing in a high capacity and high quality way, and if they have the ability to make those decisions for the benefit of the patient, they could potentially do so. Just as an example of key aspects of the platform that are very difficult, if not impossible, for them to do with current day EMRs. Other portals exist for specialty pharmacies, which we know are very prominent in the delivery of orphan and rare disease therapies. And then manufacturers who who develop therapies for rare diseases often have a challenge getting access to aggregated, de-identified data that they can make decisions on how well the distribution model is working for their therapy and for the patients they're serving. So here's just an example of some of the analytics. And this example comes out of a study that was done on Hep C. One would think that hepatitis C, having a 12-week regimen for a cure, would be a slam dunk, and that it would be simple to track, that people would get, and the fact that the therapies have very little side effects and are very safe and efficacious, that there wouldn't be any challenges. Trio Health, working with the manufacturers that develop therapies for that disease state, found quite the opposite. But here's an example of some of the data that comes off of one of the dashboards that they lay on top of their platform. So they can see outcomes, they can see performance of various stakeholders, in this case, time to fill in days to fill the prescriptions. They can also see if their patients are missing information that's appropriate for that medication to be provided to them. They can see in the right-hand side and click on any one of those buttons, and a list and the details of that patient will be available for them to take action. If the data is something that they can take action on. And as a matter of fact, every patient in the system is tracked to all these stakeholders, and all the data elements, the ownership of each data element is tracked to a stakeholder, so they can be prompted for the information that's pertinent to them, and not have noise about information that's not pertinent to them, that they can't provide. Here are a couple of other examples. In this case, it's a patient dashboard where a clinician can look at his or her patient's experience and outcomes to a national sample. Again, this is data that was specific to the Hep C study. It would definitely look different for Prader-Willi or any other disease. This is another dashboard that shows a clinician being able to compare one group of patients to the other. And if you can imagine how vast the list of data elements and characteristics are, those can appear in these two columns. In this particular example, they're looking at regimen, duration, genotype. This is fibrosis of the liver. That's specific to this disease. Pharmacy and payer type. So now when we look at patient outcomes, we can look at them in a much more discrete way to determine whether or not you're comparing apples to apples based upon profiles of one comparative group to another. Keeping one, so for example, in this particular example, they're actually looking at Harvoni, the Harvoni regimen 8 weeks versus 12 weeks of therapy, all genotypes, fibrosis 4, all pharmacies, and all payers. The specialty pharmacies have the ability to measure their performance, whether it be by looking at the work that they're doing with any particular payer or physician or patient. And of course, if they don't get paid, they can't perform. So understanding the revenue aspect for a specialty pharmacy, since they're a for-profit, is an important part of the metrics. Are they getting paid for the work that they're doing? And is one insurance carrier or the other more advantageous for that patient? And then there's just a few more bubble charts, different types of designs that I wanted to show you so you can imagine, based upon the data that you're looking at and what you're trying to accomplish, the questions you're trying to answer, different styles of graphics, and analytical output is available. This is a very, it could be the mission statement for TRIO, but if not, it's a second-tier mission statement. They really believe that if you shine the light on data in a unbiased way and you focus on delivering what's best for the patients, that all the other stakeholders will ultimately win, if not in the short term, from their perspective, certainly in the long term. There are a couple of other graphs which I'm going to make available because I'm concerned about time, so Jessica can have them and share them with other people. But I mentioned earlier, this is a list of patient records for which a clinician can take action on if there's something that's missing or necessary for them to do so. These are similar. I want to spend a few more minutes on the publication strategy because that's important. For many of you in the room, depending upon the role that you're playing, you can help drive research for this community and shine a light on the elements that need to be shared from a research output perspective and guide the direction and use of therapies based upon real-world data and real patient outcomes. So for Hep C, TRIO brought the who's who in the medical field together to serve on a steering committee and looked at all the data that was available across therapies in an unbiased manner and took an aggressive approach to their publication strategy. There's some samples here. So they looked at the quality of physician performance. And as it turned out, that Hep C, which is a cure, there were patients that actually missed the opportunity, naive patients, to get access to the therapies and impacted total cure rates. The slide also shows that the best performers were those that followed the FDA regimen that was on the label. So it also proved that when FDA approved the product that they got the regimen right. Patient access to care. Out of 2,100 scripts that were looked at in one of the data sets, there were 17% of these patients never started. 5% were still pending over 150 days that prescription was out in limbo, never started that therapy, and 78% starts. This shows the impact on revenue. So lost revenue, but there's also the ability to analyze this data by payer. Medicaid had the largest problem. There was a lot in the press around whether or not we're just taking care of the cirrhotic patients or not. But that would be like saying to a breast cancer patient, well, don't worry, we're covering you when you're at stage 4. Top Medicaid states, the denials, Tennessee had a 96% denial rate. This is for a therapy that cures the disease. And this is where TRIO believes in partnering with patient organizations because, and working with the scientific steering committees, because who is TRIO Health? As Brent Clough, the CEO, says, we're just a healthcare technology company. What are we going to be able to do or say to affect this change or advocate on behalf of patients that deserve access to that therapy? And although they actually did try working with CMS and a couple of other advocates, ultimately CMS did put out this notice to say that what those states were doing was illegal and they have to cover those patients. So and then they did some more work on the affordability of 8-week versus 12-week, and the results actually found that people were doing well under the 8-week. And Brent, I've heard him say that you would think the manufacturers would be upset about this because when you analyze this data, it's whatever the outcome is whatever it is, whether it's positive or negative. That's the deal. And in this particular case, the manufacturers weren't necessarily upset that the 8 weeks worked better because ultimately it saved money in other places. So this is just a few more examples of a price reduction, more analysis on that particular topic. And then there was some safety concerns on using the proton pump, the effect of the proton pump inhibitors, and they did some analysis. Actually, FDA had some concerns, so they went into their database, did a different analysis, and found out that the initial work that was done was not robust enough to lead to the proper or full conclusion. So it turned out to have another benefit that wasn't originally planned for when they first designed the initial studies. So in closing, we're excited to be working with the Prader-Willi community and the Foundation for Prader-Willi Research using the global registry platform that you all have developed, the registry, and on the NORD platform. We're looking forward to working with TRIO to take their experience with the analytics and access to real-world data and merge that. We're actually starting to work on a pilot project to look at the data that's already been captured, but we're also looking at how do we incorporate some of these features and functions so that the community is well empowered to be driving the research and the capture of real-world data that you need to have the most powerful voice when it comes to developing therapies for Prader-Willi moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. So if I understand correctly, just to put this in a little bit of context, for example, like for growth hormone, we hear that there's some people have issues with access, some, or by age. So this type of analytics tool could give us a way to start answering questions of if there's discrepancies in access to growth hormone, can we identify if it's a state issue? Can we identify if it's a payer issue? Or is it a time of prescription, writing to prescription being filled? Those are the types of analytical power that can come out of this for current therapies and for some of the therapies that we're pushing forward. Is that correct. Okay, perfect. Our last speaker for the panel this morning is Dr. Shu Han. He is a PhD biostatistician from PhD from MD Anderson, has worked in the pharma industry for over a decade in clinical trial design and is currently at Pfizer. And he's going to be speaking with us about a little bit of a shift in how clinical trials are being designed in terms of what's called adaptive clinical trial design, which are clinical trials that just have a little bit more flexibility in adapting the protocol during the trial in order to hopefully reach the fastest answer as quickly as possible.
Happy to be here, so thanks for the opportunity. It's working, yeah. So the title here is Adaptive Clinical Trials. We just scratch the surface here and give an overview of adaptive trials. So this is an example that actually intrigued me getting into the research and implementation of adaptive trials. So it's ECMO is a device that's invented in 1980s. So the purpose of this device is for desperately ill infants. That this device can take over the job for breathe and for the heart work, then let the body to survive, let the body to heal. So this device, when it's invented, the University of Michigan did a trial. So this is a trial. It's we call it investigator-initiated trial. It's have very small sample size. It's 11 patients for treatment arm and for control arm. So SOC is the standard of care. So this trial is lasted for several months, and actually for 11 on the treatment arm, all the patients survived, but only one in control group died. And at that time, the survival is the primary endpoint. So FDA and all the global regulatory agencies is relying on the survival to make a decision on approve or not. The dominant opinion, as you can imagine, is only 11 patients, so it's not really large sample size, so no conclusion need larger trials. So even the regular agency is saying that this is too small sample size. But at that time, some statisticians conduct analysis with totality data. It's including a lot of real-world data to do the analysis, and concluded that actually ECMO is much better. So they went to public and call for immediate deployment of the device. But the story evolves as the regulatory agency refused to do that and require a much larger trial. And so the Harvard University and the UK, they launched another 2 studies, which lasted for 2 years. This is a much larger study. Everything is gold standard as FDA and regular agencies required on the sample size, on the power, everything. So it would require 120 patients per arm. And the outcome lasts for 2 years. The outcome actually is consistent, and even for the probability, that's consistent with what statisticians predicted years early. So the approved shortly after the trial results announced. But the Science magazine tracked this evolvement of the events. Actually, if ECMO was deployed earlier, lots of babies, thousands of babies' lives will be saved. So in recent Sarepta's drug approval at advisory board meeting, Dr. Janet Woodcock, who is CDER, the FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, she made comments. I think it's relevant to why real-world data and adaptive trial should be more used. So in clinical trial, we're concerned about 2 types of errors. Type 1 error is a false positive. So it means that's what FDA is more concerned about. It means to avoid to approve inefficacious or unsafe drug or device. But Dr. Woodcock actually commented on it that there is type 2 error, is false negative. So if the drug or device is actually working, but we prolong the time to get approval, or we get failure to get approval, actually the disease, the outcome of this is actually can be devastating, especially for the disease that is is a serious diseases. So actually, the adaptive trial and using totality data, it's highlighted by Science magazine for years. So actually, there is another positive example that how we use data to implement that actually save a lot of time and bring the treatment to patients earlier. So in MD Anderson, this drug, trastuzumab, actually it's the brand name called Herceptin. It's for breast cancer. So this trial, phase 2 breast cancer trial, this is phase 2 means still exploratory. It's the trial before the confirmatory trial, but confirmatory trial is relying on this trial phase 2's result to proceed. So when the Herceptin was in development, this is many years ago, the primary endpoint is complete response of tumor. So the planned traditional sample size in MD Anderson, MD Anderson is the largest cancer center in US. So the sample size is 164. It's 82 patient per arm. So you can see patient accrual. So that's clinical trial. A painful fact is that especially for rare disease or cancer, the patient enrollment is very slow. So it's prolong the timeline to get a result, also prolong the availability of the drug or device available to patients. So you can see it's 1.5 patients per month. You can calculate how many years it's going to take to get a result of this. So MD Anderson Cancer Center is a think tank on adaptive trials. So at that time, this is a still relatively new idea. So DSMB, Data Safety Monitoring Board, they conducted a trial result on only 34 patients. It's about, it's a little more than 1/5 of the total sample size getting enrolled. So we conduct analysis, and so you see the result is 4 out of 16 patients in control arm achieve the primary endpoint. And by sharp comparison, in the Herceptin trial, we have 2/3, 12 out of 18 patients achieved the primary response. So at that time, because this adaptive trial initiative, so we conduct probability to, we calculate the predicted probability of the Herceptin versus control. The Herceptin have a 95 probability that Herceptin is better. So DSMB can stop the trial because it's unethical to continue to enroll patients to placebo arm. So this is consistent with a much larger trial later on, and which lead to FDA approval. So this actually accelerated Herceptin availability to patients. So now we come to a little, the theory or segmentation of adaptive clinical trials. One is called early success or futility. We want to look at the data in not only just wait for end, and because it's need to maintain blinding, we want to install more interim analysis. And if the data shows superiority or futility, we want to stop early. Stop early for success or futility. Another one is a drop add arm design. So that means if we do a dose ranging trial, if the dose between 2 doses we see some signal, we want to add one more dose in between, or there is a lower dose is not effective, then we want to drop it. So the whole idea is one is to accelerate the drug approval. The next reason for doing this is to minimize the risk to patients enrolled into trial. So sample size re-estimation, if the drug effect is not as efficacious as we targeted for, then we may want to increase the sample size to study it more. Or adaptive randomization, it's just to adaptively adjust the randomization ratio to put more patients in a more efficacious drug arm. So I will expand on each of this a little bit. So early success or futility, so basically at each interim analysis, at each interim look, we will take into a totality data to make a decision, because the clinical trial can be very long. And along the implementation of a clinical trial, there's more data come out from like hospital, from even a patient advocacy group that help the drug sponsor to make a decision whether to stop the trial for efficacy or futility. Another one, the drop add arm. This is mostly used in dose finding. So there is a dose regimen for a drug can be complex to study. So it's when the data come out from the trial, it might be contradicting the original assumption on the drug. So we retain the flexibility to drop and add arm design. Another one is sample size re-estimation. So the clinical trials data, when it's emerging from the trial, then it might have a certainty that the drug effect may be not as efficacious, or the variability is more than we thought, then we retain the flexibility to re-estimate sample size. Adaptive randomization, this is personally my favorite on the adaptive trial, is we can adjust randomization ratio. If the trial result come out saying, okay, if the treatment really works, so typical trial have a fixed randomization ratio. It's a 1-to-1 active to placebo. And if the drug really working, we want to adjust that to put more patients into the more efficacious arm instead of just waiting to the end. That's because for some devastating disease, that outcome can be life and death. So this is my last slide. It's the evolving future of the clinical trial. So there is a lot of thoughts about how to improve the efficiency and to also treat patients in the clinical trial more ethically. So the future clinical trial, in my humble opinion, I think that's adaptive platform across investigational drugs, devices, doses, and indications. So currently, is each drug company conducts their own clinical trial. So each trial have an active versus placebo. So imagine if all the company put together their resources, you only need one placebo arm, right? So it's, and also, also if we have equipped with adaptive randomization, then across all the candidate drugs available, then we can assign patients to more efficacious arm along the trial. So it's also, this require collaboration across companies to put multiple investigational drug or device into adaptive trial platform. So this is somewhat, it's slower than, I would rather it's happening. And actually FDA is taking a spearheaded role to, accelerate this. We adaptively adjust the randomization ratio. So it's to the best treatment, and with a minimize the time to get approval, because the enrollment and the follow-up time, it's really slowing down the scientific discoveries, the benefit to be available to patients. And we ultimately, we also want to minimize the placebo group sample size. It's really to, for fatal diseases, this is, I'm doing clinical trial every day and monitoring the trial, so it's some cases really hard to bear. So that's, I think that's the future of adaptive clinical trials. So that's the last slide. Thank you.
Okay, so we just threw a lot of information at everybody. There are conferences that last for days on real-world data, and we just tried to cram it all into an hour and a half. But we're going to give everybody, we're a little bit over time. We're going to give everybody about 10 minutes or so, decompress, grab some coffee. And then the goal now is that sort of now that we've given a little bit of a background of ways that real-world data can be collected, so mobile apps, devices, all of the data that's available in insurance records and in pharmacy records. There's all of that data out there. We know that there's ways that we can implement it. And so now the task is, as a community, now sort of getting feedback from the community to start trying to understand if we're developing devices or apps, or if we're trying to ask questions through the data that's out there through medical records and insurance records. What are those things going to look like? What are our priorities as a community? Ian is a parent of somebody with PWS, as well as a member of the drug and pharma community. So he brings a phenomenal dual expertise, dual perspective, and he has graciously agreed to lead our panel discussion. This is somewhat informal. Basically, we're going to provide opportunities for the panelists to give their perspective on some of the questions that we were just discussing in our groups. But if we have questions from the audience, that is, this is the opportunity for us to engage those conversations. So I will let Ian moderate, but we want to make sure that we are getting, this is your opportunity for all of the workshop participants to have that Q&A session with the panelists. Ian, all yours.
Okay. First of all, thank you for asking me to chair this. Let's ask a question of everybody that took part in this. Was that useful? Was that fun? Did you learn some things from the people you were talking with and from your fellow colleagues as well? Great. So, I don't know if we want to go through the panel, but in our little group, I think we went through most of the symptomatic problems that PWS patients have, and then sort of tried to look to see if we could look towards those and design things which were either going to be for a healthcare benefit or for a clinical trial benefit. And I think there's probably two dimensions to what we've done today. How do you feel about that? Is it healthcare that's most important, or is it clinical trials that's most important?
No? All right,
Yes.
there we go. I guess both, right? Ideally, we would be able to try and tackle both things in parallel. In our group, maybe just as a quick summary, in our group, we discussed a couple of different things that struck me. One was using, I guess, ABA therapy that's done with some of the kids, and using that as a model for maybe developing a mobile app or some kind of way to capture data out of those sessions. We talked about a lot of different possibilities, but a lot of the theme was around how do we get data that could be used with the healthcare process, with physicians not really understanding the disease and having perceptions about, let's say, what temperature represents, as one example we talked about. And using that to develop data that would educate physicians in the care of PWS patients, or nurses, or any of the healthcare providers. So that was definitely along the theme that you mentioned there, Ian, of the healthcare side. And then I think the data that would come out of some of this work could end up being structured into some kind of tools that you all could use, whether it's in or outside or alongside a trial, right? Because I think we all know of examples where the trial structure doesn't capture the full experience of what you all deal with. So I think I just quickly summarized our group, but I'll let others.
I agree with Chris. So it's going to be beneficial to both, to healthcare and to clinical trial setting, and they are actually interrelated. So I'll give you an example. So I'm involved heavily with Pfizer's Duchenne muscular dystrophy program. So what we found out that some FDA's golden standard endpoint actually it's not entirely capture the patient journey, like 6-minute walk or 4-stair climb time. So it's because there's, for example, for the 4-stair climb, it's just a 4 stairs climb that you just take the time of the duration, like how many seconds. But actually, the patient's symptom improvement cover much broader aspects rather than that. Like we measured, stand from supine, and also how they walk, and like 10 minutes run. So it's many aspects we can see from video, but it's just hard to incorporate into endpoints. So if we have the device or like real-world device recording can measure well-rounded aspects of patient activity, So one thing is we know much clearer what this disease actually symptom, its onset of the symptoms are, and also we know we can design a drug to improve different aspects. It's not only just hinge on one endpoint. So this endpoints issues actually also contributed to many, drug. It's not well studied and maybe only beneficial to one subset of patients, but we're feeling challenges to prove that is the case. So this is absolutely it's in interrelated aspects between the healthcare and clinical trial setting.
With our children now is that they're well controlled and that weight loss is not a measure of hyperphagia anymore. In any of the teams, did we have any ideas of what could be a good measure of hyperphagia? Was there ideas? Reduction in food seeking, yeah.
Well, the reduction in food seeking, imagine would be a good measure of, hyperphagia, and that could be subjective to whoever's observing the child or if they're able to speak for themselves. But, I mean, if that would be my only thought on how you could measure something like that, if it's not going to be weight loss.
A thought I had, and this is sort of like hyperphagia and behavior, which is just taking a 5-minute or 10-minute talk sample and to measure how often they're talking about food or asking about when's the next meal, and I don't know what the right amount of time would be, but something like that. Anybody else?
Sorry.
One of the things that we talked about was having them sort of answer the questions about how often is our thoughts of food impacting your ability to do daily tasks. So, do you think about food so much that you can't concentrate in school? Do you think about food so much that you're late to go to school? Like those kinds of things. And again, whether it's some kind of interactive, one of the things that Ian talked about was use of games that, most of our kids are using some kind of gaming, whether it's on the computer or on their smartphone or whatever, and so some kind of interactive game that would maybe help with that. And Jason talked about the fact that they just bought the Echo for their daughter, and that they're using that to, so she can talk to that. It's sort of an elevated Siri, I guess, for those who don't know. And that she's using that to communicate sort of her questions. It's helping her with homework, but, it's also helping them to stop with the perseveration, because one of the things that my daughter does constantly is perseverate. The same question asked different ways in the same span of, 10 minutes or whatever. And so I think trying to get at that and trying to alleviate that piece too is something that we need to be looking at.
Sorry. One thing that came up in our group that I really think could be helpful across the board with a lot of different issues is the idea of videoing a little bit. So even with hyperphagia, thinking of videoing the family around dinner time. When the parents are making the meal, what's happening around that, and seeing the child's reaction to the food and waiting for it, and throughout the dinner, when the dinner's over, and then seeing the progression of that. To me, that if I knew nothing about PWS, that would show it to me in such a way that these paper endpoints cannot. So, and I think when you think about so many different symptoms, that can help.
RA about geofencing. What about doing that? In other words, putting sensors in the house and seeing how often they're in the kitchen.
I think that's an idea, except if you're in my house, I'm yelling, get out of the kitchen. I'll tell you when it's ready.
But maybe that's I had the idea of giving them stress balls and seeing how often they hit the stress ball if they're thinking about food. And we could put sensors in the stress ball and measure how many times they hit the stress ball. How many people their children have things to play with for stress? Yeah. Quite a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. I don't know if it's feasible in a home environment, but I know when we've seen Dr. Roof, we did the, what is that called with the thing on the head, and they looked at the pictures. The ER, right, to see if they're, if you don't want to use weight loss as, you know, to hyperphagia, if you do something like that, like they're, see how much they're perseverating basically on the food pictures. I know that'd be more of a clinical thing, but it would be something different than just straight weight loss.
Okay, good.
Just to say something else on that, for those of us who really have to stay away from weight loss for hyperphagia, because we lock up everything for our son and have since he was little, and we've been told so many times, but you sure your son has Prader-Willi syndrome? He's not fat, or he's not heavy. Well, and as we discussed here, if you lock up the food, anybody can lose weight, you know, and so, you know, how much somebody weighs or doesn't weigh has, you know, nothing to do with it.
No, I totally agree, absolutely agree.
But the doctors don't always.
No.
Schools don't.
Absolutely.
So one of the things we talked about, because we were talking about the wearable devices, was, you know, we know anxiety is a huge problem in our kids, and measuring that decrease in anxiety, we don't even know if you took away the hunger, would that decrease the anxiety, or would they just become anxious about different things, right? So I think we presume, and maybe the Balorinib study showed a little bit, that if you take away the hunger, you likely will decrease the anxiety, but we don't know that for sure. So one of the questions we had was, you know, for a wearable device, you know, can you actually measure anxiety through physiologic means? And I guess that would entail maybe kind of a natural history of all of our kids wearing these devices, and then the parents time stamping when anxiety happened, and then seeing if we could kind of pick up a signature. I mean, to me, that would be, in a perfect world, that would be a really nice way of measuring the impact of a drug, because I think what I hear from all families is the anxiety around the food is a true difficulty. So
We had a similar discussions, basically identifying what those markers are that are leading into an anxiety attack or a temper outburst, and then also deciding what, you know, is there a benefit to having a warning, like either self-monitoring, like, you know, hey, things are looking a little rough, how are you doing? And or a warning to a teacher or a parent, like, hey, things are looking a little rough, you might want to check in and, you know, see if they need a break, or, you know, sort of to mitigate something before it happens. Chris, you had something you wanted to say?
Just to add that our group talked about the same thing, so I would say that's a consistent theme, yeah.
I will say, I'm not sure about the other groups. Our group, with regards to incorporating real-world data into clinical trials, there was definitely sort of a consensus that if there's, you know, any way to incorporate real-world data to minimize or to somehow reduce clinic visits, that would be great. However, sort of expertise in the group, that's the goal, but not knowing how to do that. So I guess my question to the panel would be, and maybe this is a question for Dr. Hahn as well, is what sort of can we envision, or what can we do to help develop real-world data tools that will reduce clinic visits?
Hello? Yeah. It's actually related to what topic I found fascinating. So in our group discussion. So one of the parents discussed that, you know, that when kids went to Disney, actually they are very motivated to do all the activities and even fill out all the, you know, do most of the activities that they usually is very hesitating or very delayed in doing. So I think this is cast a good point for our device designers or app designers like Chris. So if we can design a app that it's fun, it's have this motivating factor in there, ask, you know, to intrigue kids to input their data in a timely fashion, and you know, also this if we think broadly, if this can be linked to any alert system to the caregiver, so this can be in the long run can be a way to reduce, you know, the healthcare cost or visit to the daycare. So visit to the clinics. But this, I would think that this is a big topic, and also different kids have different interests. So how we can, design this app is intriguing enough for kids to engage in. So I think that's maybe a direction to worth exploring.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think I would encourage this group to start some kind of development of a rubric, right? So the goal is a good one, but the risk for the sponsors is can I use that tool in this trial? So that's where you guys play the role of driving forward without the drug intervention being at risk, getting the tool towards validation or, ideally validated. That's a several-year process, right? It takes maybe, let's just say, several studies before a tool could be used with that kind of confidence. Now, the FDA and sponsors can negotiate flexibility, can talk about exploratory endpoint use, but the ideal is that you guys help develop the tool so that so that the protocols can then say, we're going to use this set of instruments for remote monitoring, for reporting of an app, for videos, whatever the answers are. That stuff could happen in parallel with these phase 2 trials that are going on right now, so that when they come around to phase 3s, or any of the trials for numbers of sponsors. So just to think about it from the sponsor's point of view, that's the dilemma, right? So if you think about the fast real-world tools that are informal, they're really good for developing the tools, but they, a Pfizer can't take it up and say, let's put this in a pivotal trial, right? The amount of concern and worry would be, okay, how are we going to make that work, right? It's not tested, so that's the dilemma.
Mine from the drug company's perspective, if you had a tool that, say, was supposed to measure anxiety, even if you had it as an exploratory endpoint, and the tool wasn't good, and the drug otherwise worked, and then you don't have a change in anxiety, then drug companies can get themselves in a bad position where, if they had not included that measure, the data would look better. So that's, I think, just to share with the group, sort of the companies, it is a big risk for them to start incorporating these new endpoints. So to the extent that we as a community can give good baseline data, I think that's a great point.
I actually agree with this, Teresa. So another point is built on what Chris said. It's for drug companies, especially for the big ones, and also the FDA. So my personal experience is if we wait for them to, react or to take initiatives, it's you will be disappointed. So it's rather than it's just the patient community, it's want to try it and build a momentum and build a critical mass and really prove that using the approved drug really making that difference. So over time, this make a real world case. Then regulatory agency want to take, because regulatory agencies their bottom is they need to safeguard the public interest. So for the new technologies, they are skeptical. I think that's to cover their ground. They are entitled to do so because it's not proven technology. But if we have real world data to prove that it's actually working and it's safe, it's not very invasive to patients' activities, I think that's maybe make a good case to for the change in the future.
It's actually incumbent upon us to do it because it's not FDA's job to do it. But they are moving forward as they can in their confines or their regulatory framework to encourage people on the outside to take on these tools, to take on these methods, so that they could use them in the most flexible way possible.
We talked about a couple of things, but one of them was how do we incentivize our kids? What are the incentives that we can use that would encourage them to use the tools that we want to measure the data on? because if it's something that there is too cumbersome for them to use, or for us to use for that matter, then no collection is going to be possible. And so we really need to think for ourselves about, okay, how much data am I personally willing to collect if I have to do data input? As opposed to the, some kind of wristband or, a video camera or something that is sort of hooked up and automatically taking snapshots, pictures, whatever, monitoring my kid's heart rate, their pulse ox we talked about, for especially those who have sleep apnea and those kinds of things. Because the more cumbersome and the more work it is for us to do, my belief is the less likely we're all going to be willing to do it, because we're so busy just trying to live our lives. So whatever we come up with, I think we need to do some testing around the community, around how likely are you to really use this, if this is how much time it's going to take you every day, or this is what you have to do in order to get your child to do this or whatever. So I think we should bear that in mind as well.
And to camp on what Amy said, we also stratified, because I was in her group, the conversation, that if we knew that, to go back to the original question, Ian, that you asked, the difference between capturing this data for health outcomes and day-to-day living versus capturing parts of whatever data set for clinical trials, that parents were more willing, so long as it wasn't overly burdensome, to be laser focused and do more to proactively contribute that data if it meant that it was going to impact a trial result. So there was some stratification that we envision would be possible in a series of solutions, if you will.
You've been waiting very patiently here. I think you want to make some comments about your group.
Jessica, just to, excuse me, to talk a bit about the question around simplifying the clinical trial process. I think it's important to know maybe a list of what are the top 5 or 6 reasons to go to the clinical visits, and then going to some of the points the panel was making. What's the risk of using data that's not done there versus that's collected off-site, and then maybe focus on some that can reduce the number of visits, maybe not all of them, and then look at a plan on how to ultimately reduce all of them, if that makes sense. Because I don't know if, say there's 20 clinical trials, is there 10 common tests that get everybody there that you have to then go back in? And of those 10, how many are thought to be risky, or, as Therese was saying, if it's not the right type of data, could impact the outcome, and, would they allow that type of data to be collected off-site? And then in our group around hyperphagia and then anxiety, it seems like there's a lot of importance around that. So I think as a group, it's important to collect this information and figure out, what's the common linkage across the age groups, and what are the things to really focus on there, and what can be done from a technology perspective, whether it's apps, whether it's devices, to help out make things, one, easier for collecting information. And then Mr. Rector in our group had brought up an important point, I think, in terms of, is there a way to get some input on, okay, this is working? People are talking about toys, or whether it's a puzzle, or is there something, so that if you try new things, then that there's something there. So I think from a software side, that's something that, given data, you can do pretty easily. But identifying these things within the group, I think, is important. So I had mentioned to Teresa, we're going to make a summary of what we got out of it, but I think it would be worthwhile from that summary to build and maybe do an organization-wide survey where you can get more information and start organizing that, and then it's say, okay, we need to be focusing on these because this is more important across the top of the groups. And then, as one of the participants was saying, we do also need to look at, if there's a burden, people aren't going to do things. If it's one more thing on your plate, then, they're not going to do it. So keeping that in mind, we would also look at the technology to make sure it's as easy as possible or reduces the burden, and that's the key.
I think one of the things that I always think about, I've had a life of developing drugs, and we've never been able to beta test a drug, because basically you'd probably kill somebody. But you can beta test an app, you can beta test a conversation with a patient in terms of how you're going to do it. And I think iterations in the IT business is something we should employ in this business as well, so that we don't expect to be good at it the first time round, but by the 7th iPhone, you're absolutely very good at it. Apart from Galaxy, by the 10th, they're not so good at it. But, you know, so we need to think about it from that perspective, and I think that's a great thing to put our mindset around, because you can't beta test drugs, but you can beta test these things. Let me ask one question. Of the parents in the room, who has children with sleep problems? Virtually all, I'd say. Sleep apnea. We've got the methods to measure that now. We can put pulse oximetry onto a patient. Tell me. And we can measure it. We can also measure activity. Is that something that would be useful to know about your children?
Except for those of us who have children with compliance problems, doing a sleep study, said, I'm not going to do this, and started ripping out things, going across.
But the point about it is extremely simple. It's just a clip on your finger and a wristwatch on your...
That's very simple for you and a lot of people. That is not simple for my son.
Okay. Okay.
Well, and I think that's a consideration, is we have to go as low sensory as possible on all of these things so we can capture, you know, some kids have more of a problem, some kids have less, but I think our level of problems is much higher. But to that point, we talked about those issues, the sleep issues, of monitoring sleep and even REM sleep, because we were told that you can monitor REM sleep, with respect to then characterizing outbursts or behavioral difficulties. So, you know, my son's older. I know he wakes up during the night. I don't think he gets good sleep, but it's certainly not something. He stays in his room. I don't really know it. And yet there are some days where he's really off and other days where he's really easygoing. And so it would be nice to see, you know, what sleep is an obvious thing that could be related to, and it would be nice to be able to do that.
You know, I've done it anecdotally. I've put a Nest camera in my son's room and now understand that he sleeps till midnight, and then after midnight, all hell breaks loose. And you're starting to appreciate what is happening. And then we're now trying to relate that to his day. But let's put some more science on it and make it a little bit more, you know, put a pulse oximeter there, put a activity measure there, and then let's see. Because the drugs we're developing, they may improve that.
Lauren, did you have something you wanted to say? Okay.
This isn't exactly related to this, but it is related to sleep, which is we also have to come up with a better way of treating sleep apnea, because a big issue is the compliance with using the device. And so even if you know their sleep is terrible, you can't treat it effectively.
Well, I think that gives us a perfect segue into lunch, into our afternoon session, which is there's an afternoon session on sleep, which is great. But first, I wanted to thank everybody for their participation in this. This was an idea that we came up with to host this workshop. Format was a little bit new. I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you tremendously for your time and your insight and your willingness to participate and to share your information and your knowledge with us, so that we can start answering these questions and giving information back to you and start tackling these problems. We have recorded a lot of this. We will be compiling all of the notes from the various different breakout sessions and from this panel discussion into a summary report that we can share back with all of the participants. In addition to the in-person session, which we were so grateful for the Cori Award to help support bringing a lot of parents in to the meeting, but we do recognize that this is an important conversation that needs to be had with the broader community. So there is going to be a web-based version of this. We're still designing what that's going to look like. So if you have friends in the PWS community that you think would really like to contribute to this conversation, when we send those announcements out and that information out, please share that. We want this to be a broader conversation in the PWS community. I think I will close there. Teresa, you want to add anything? If you have your forms, please turn those into me on the way out. Lunch is downstairs, I think. If we could please just take a moment and thank all of our panelists. Thank you.